Now, obviously, when you qualify at Onderstepoort, I don't think you will be able to do all these things immediately. You should at least be able to identify problems that is related to nutrition. But I will tell you right at the end, why is it important and how can you develop your skills and what is needed, what sort of information is needed to be able to develop into a veterinary nutritionist. To me, it's when you're dealing with production animals, it's very important that you are very skillful with regard to veterinary nutrition. And I want to emphasize right from the start that teamwork is essential with all other disciplines. Teamwork with pasture scientists, the nutritionists, and all these people. And I'm glad that Kenneth also emphasized that yesterday. And so I want to re-emphasize, the teamwork. Okay, when we evaluate nutrition and problem solving, there's a lot of things. And due to time limitation, we can't speak about all these things. I mean, you always have a history with regard to health aspects, milk production, quality, reproductive performance of dairy herds. You've got feeds and storage and quality of management with regard to that. Richard Venter yesterday gave an excellent talk on silage. And those are the sort of things that you must have a good understanding of. You are not a specialist on that, but you must have a very good understanding about silage. And the same apply with dry hays. The same principles. If you think about your grass hays and your legume hays like lucerne and so on, and all the different concentrates, how is it stored and how is it managed? Housing and feeding system. What type of housing have you got? Have you got a pasture-based system or have you got intensive housing? And what feeding system? Now, obviously, with the picture on the bottom there, we're dealing with a TMR system and with intensive housing or a freestall barn. Sorry, there's someone who's not muted.
Ja, he's not. Ek het hom ingeskakel.
Okay.
As 'n dairy school ding wat weer nie gang is. Maar hulle praat in elk geval eers oor nutrition en daai goed so. Nee, wat jy kan enige tyd praat dan is.
Sorry, Michael de Klerk, just unmute yourself, please. We can hear your conversation.
Ja, sy swanger.
Okay.
Nee, sy swanger.
So as I've said, I'm going to concentrate a bit on the feeding system. We mustn't forget about water quality. There's a lot of quality issues, and I can remember many quality problems with water that I was involved with over the years. Sorry, there's someone.
Is daar so hier put it
Heifers and cow herd, and then special procedures is obviously if you do special things like liver biopsies and taking blood samples, say for instance with regard to trace minerals, you do a detailed rumen evaluation, taking the pH and the microbes and so on in the rumen, and then the rations. So finally the rations, and then right at the end, I will talk a little bit about dry cow management, because obviously dry cow management is critical in the success of nutrition on dairy farms. And this was my experience over many years. I'm just very briefly going to talk a little bit about heifers. You all know that they are the future of the dairy herd, and management during all these developmental phases is critical, because we've got certain targets with those heifers, and so age at breeding and age at first calving is critical, and that obviously relates to economical aspects. So that is one of the many reasons why you need to know a little bit about economy. You need to know about variable costs and fixed costs, and the feed cost, for instance. So eventually what is going to cost you to raise these heifers, and which is an unproductive stage. So calving management starting right there is critical, and we haven't got time obviously to go into all this detail. And then yesterday, Kenneth, during the milk feeding period, he gave 2 or 3, I remember, excellent case studies with regard to calves. And I also, in my career, experienced many case scenarios where calf rearing was a problem. I actually had the privilege to have, in my active years, I had the postgrad student that did a study for his M on accelerated growth rate in calves. And so very briefly, that's where the calves received ad-lib milk in comparison to the controls, which had the traditional restricted milk yield. And the ones that received ad-lib milk, outperform the calves and the heifers later on with regard to growth rate and fertility eventually, and after the first lactation, with the milk production. And this is also something that Kenneth mentioned yesterday, so I want to emphasize that. So you've got all these different managemental issues, and nutrition amongst this is obviously the most important. Just want to remind you, and I'm pretty sure you've got this in your notes, with the ideal targets or indices for heifers. Age at conception, approximately 15 months. Certain breeds like jerseys and so on, we know that we can get conception much earlier than that even. And then by that stage, they must weigh at 66% of mature weight. Your heat detection rate and your fertility parameters should be very high in heifers in comparison to the cow herd, because obviously the heifers only need to grow. They don't produce milk, and they just need to get pregnant. So, and I've seen this very often. Those indices, farmers can achieve that. I've got evidence of that type of AIs per conception, for instance, as low as 1.3. The culling for fertility in heifers must obviously be low. Wil die ding nie aanbeweeg nie. Daar sy. Sorry for that. Okay, I'm going to kick off with the case studies with a very extreme, very easy and case study that I had many years ago in my young life as a veterinarian. When I went out to a dairy herd, and after I've done some routine work, me and the students went and did a farm walk, and we investigated all other aspects on the farm just to acquaint ourselves. And amongst other things, I came across this. You can see in the left picture there, heifers with poor growth and condition and very poor fertility performance. There were serious health problems. There was even signs of subacute rumen acidosis there, and then eventually high mortality rate. And when you see that, how they feed these heifers, and they use the chopped Eragrossus curvula hay mixed with maize meal. Now, that is fairly obvious. You're going to have very serious nutritional problems with regard to nutrient deficiencies, which will explain all these symptoms in the heifers. Sorry for that. And the reason why I've put this extreme case in is you can say, well, I mean, this is so simple, but we must remember that we live in South Africa. And with our service in South Africa, we've got the developing farmers, we've got small-scale farmers. And it's quite possible that you can come across such situations. And this case is so easy that you actually don't need the help of a nutritionist because it's quite easy to solve the problem. Now, just for interest's sake, if you look at that composition of that mix on a dry matter basis versus NRC recommendations for growing heifers, you will see that the crude protein is only 8%. The energy density is 10.1, much lower than the recommendations of 11.2. The calcium, shocking low, 0.13. Phosphate, very low. And so you can go on with all sorts of other nutrients. So obviously you need to advise this farmer how to farm with, how to feed heifers. Now there's various options. Obviously, you've got you can do component feeding where you feed your refuges separate from your concentrates, but then your concentrate supplement need to be a balanced growth concentrate. And a better option, in my opinion, is to go for a TMR system, a total mixed ration system, where the nutritionist can formulate a nice diet for these heifers. The second case study is also on the herd that I'm just going to do in the next over about 5 minutes now. The heifers on that herd. This herd is situated in a beautiful part of the country, in the Mpumalanga escarpment area. The Crocodile River runs through the farm, and it's actually, I enjoyed going out to that farm. And it's a pasture-based system with kikuyu and then perennial ryegrass and clovers. And then the growth concentrate and grass hay was supplemented on the pastures to those heifers. So when you investigate, and the little graphs that you see below there for different times, 1993, 90, so you can see that's quite far back. There was optimal growth and suboptimal conception rates. And the average age at first calving was only 29 months. So obviously you need to adapt that system, and that's where what Kenneth also emphasized yesterday. You don't really need to change that. You just need to look at the amounts that you give, and perhaps bringing in something like silage, which I'll tell you about later on with regard to what happened to the cow herd. Then the third case study on heifers, before we carry on with the cow herd. In this case, the heifers was also component feeding. So you feed your refuges separate from your concentrate. And the heifers were fed ad-lib grass hay, which was of good quality, and ad-lib growth concentrate. There was, when we retrospectively went back, there was poor conception rates, and very clearly when we evaluated the condition of the heifers, they were overweight. They were fat heifers. There was a high proportion of heifers with a body condition score of more than 4. Now, this is totally unacceptable in heifers. And the reason for that is obvious. You can again see it there, where they've got ad-lib growth concentrate available. So they just eat as much as they can. So there's a limitation in the amount of growth concentrate, and you need to monitor the condition and the growth rate of heifers. So for that, we've got the standard growth tables that we can use. So it was no surprise when these heifers calved. There's a student in the background there. I remember the case very clearly. There was classical symptoms of calving problems, retained fetal membrane metritis, postnatal depression, inappetence, clinical. These heifers, first primiparous cows. Sorry for that, I've just got a bit of a cold. Clinical ketosis, and there was even cases of left displaced apomasum. And they show clinical ketosis. You can see that cow there she's depressed. Her tongue is sticking out. And if you look at the picture on the left bottom, they licked themselves, their skins, that nothing was left. And there was 1 or 2 that died, and then that was a typical pathology of overfat heifers, liver grass pathology, yellow liver, fatty changes in the liver, and no surprise that there was poor subsequent milk yield and fertility performance. So one must guard against that with regard to both the heifers and the cow. You don't want 2 fat heifers and 2 fat cows at dry off and calving. You know that very well. And your target body condition at calving should be 3, and not really more than that, because then you can have a risk of this. Obviously, when we come on the other side, when your body condition score at calving is low, then you're also going to experience a lot of problems. So you want to avoid those sort of problems. So when we come to the cow herd, as I've said, I'm going to do a pasture-based system with you. And you know about the two basic feeding methods, feeding forages separately, and then a TMR or a complete feed, usually together with, there are different housing systems for that. So pasture-based system, as you know, just very quickly, you feed it separately. You also call it component feeding, and there are numerous options with regard to roughages. You've got your veld, your pastures, green chop, hay, silage, straw, croplands, all that is, as you know, are roughages. And then the concentrates can be fed in the parlour, post-parlour transponders, or even on pasture systems. And then there's an option of going for a partial TMR to your supplementary feeding to mix it into a balanced TMR and then feed that together, and then there's less chance for rumen digestive problems. So this is old news to you, where the concentrates on pasture-based systems is fed in parlour. The picture on the right at the top is a herd that we're going to discuss now. Here at the post-parlour system, you've got this old transponder system, which you don't often see many more. The in-parlour systems is usually controlled with electronically. So as groups of cows come in, they will obviously, each group will, for the average cow in that group, will get their specific amount of concentrates to supplement the pasture to address the pasture limitations. And so this case study was a family farm at that stage. And now you will tell me nowadays you don't get many family farms anymore. If you look at the dairy industry, what happened over the years, in my young days, there used to be thousands of dairy producers. And on Monday, you heard a bit more about the dairy industry, what happened and so on. You can still here and there get family farms of that sort of size. As I told you, this farm was a beautiful farm with regard to nature and so on. There was Crocodile River is going through the farm, so this farmer was also involved in a very successful ecotourism. You can go and do trout fishing there, you cycle, hiking, and stay in beautiful chalets. So I'm just mentioning that because that played a role in this whole syndrome that we experienced on this herd. Now the farmer has got perennial ryegrass and clover available, 8 camps of 3 hectares. Now, as you know, perennial ryegrass and clover is, the one is grass, clover is obviously a legume, and those are cool season grasses and clover, and kikuyu camps, which are summer grass, subtropical grass. He's got camps available. And then farmer has got produced maize silage, which unfortunately he stopped producing in 2000. And that was a part of the whole problem as well. And then he's got irrigrasses available that he can produce on the farm. And then purchase concentrates and on-farm mixing and free choice minerals. So this was a history. I can keep you busy for a long time to discuss all the problems that we experienced during 91 to 2001. But he stopped producing maize silage. And shortly after that, there was low body condition score, all stages of the production cycle. Those are the cows there just before the holding yards, before they enter the milking parlour. There was suboptimal milk yield as an average, as a ballpark figure was only 24, which is low. I mean, you and I know nowadays in these large pasture-based systems in KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape and the Southern Cape and so on, those farmers achieve values of well above 30 litres. There was also low milk protein and high milk urea nitrogen, and there was a high incidence of peripartal problems such as metritis, endometritis. And then there was a significant unestrus problem and no surprise, poor conception rates. I just want to remind you on the production cycle of the dairy cow. When we evaluate nutrition and health aspects and all other aspects, obviously we need to know what happens with regard to milk production and the lactation curve. I mean, you've got the initial milk yield, and then the cow peak at 4 to 8 weeks. So for that, she needs a massive amount of nutrients, which the rumen can't supply, because the rumen is still adapting. There's limited capacity of the rumen. In that transition period, which actually starts 3 weeks before calving, you've obviously got a lot of things that need to adapt, like the microbial population, the rumen papillae, and so on. And then just before calving, you've also got the severe drop in dry matter intake. As you can see there with the dry period, that severe drop in the blue line, the dry matter intake, which drops severely, as values as low as 1.4% of body weight is your dry matter intake, which is pretty low. So especially cows fresh in milk, we know that they run into a negative energy balance, and that emphasizes a yellow line, the condition, why your condition needs to be 3 at calving, so that you've got enough energy reserves available, because you know that these cows are going into a negative energy balance. And obviously, the higher the production level of the herd, the more severe is this going to be. And we want to start breeding at 60 to, your breeding window is about 60 to 120 days in milk. And obviously that condition is critical. You don't want those cows to drop below 2 condition. And so all these things you need to take in mind. If you take mid to late lactation, obviously you've got the persistency of the lactation curve, and then they obviously need to rebuild conditions so that when you dry them off, they're already in a 3 condition. They need to maintain that during the early phase of the dry period, and then the close-up phase, which usually starts about 3 weeks before calving. So if times allow, we can talk a little bit about that right at the end. There are limitations to manual and visual condition scoring. I've done this a lot in my career with the students. It's time consuming. There is subjectivity to that, and it's seldom done too irregular. And the problem with this is that you don't detect immediate changes immediately. And very often there's little or no integration with herd management. So with these very modern systems like Delpro, for instance, from De Laval, you can monitor body condition nowadays on a daily basis. The same as with the weight of the cows, not only Delpro, but also other programs like Afikim and Afimilk and Waikato and so on, so that you can take immediate action when needed. There was suboptimal milk yield. As I've said, we only had this very limited information on milk yield, just the average as a ballpark figure were low. And you can get various reports such as these average lactation curves and so on. But that graph on the right top there is a little program that the farmer used to use those years, which generated this type of report for different years and so on, so you can compare, and it's according to those days in milk below, 0 to 83 days in milk and so on and so on. So there's limitations to that. So we know now in modern systems that we, with these Delpro, Afikim and all these fantastic programs that is available, is that allow for immediate action when indicated, when you get a severe drop in milk yield. And we must remember that there are many factors that influence milk yield and quality. And I'm going to mention some of this, but time don't allow to go into all the detail of that. But I'm pretty sure you've got that in your notes anyway. So just go and revise here. A few weeks ago, I went to visit an old farmer friend, which I went to very often in my younger days, just to go and visit him. And when I arrived on the farm, there was the nutritionist was there, he was called upon by the private veterinarian, which picked up serious problems in the cows fresh in milk. And because that farmer is running the Delpro system, and immediately they saw that there was a decreased intake, dry matter intake, a severe sudden drop in milk yield, and then obviously no surprise, the animals dropped in condition, and they were actually sick and depressed and so on. So there was actually a ketosis problem. And yeah, so when you, that's a beauty of when you monitor the things on an ongoing basis in comparison to what we used to have in the old days. As I've said, there was a high metritis, endometritis complex and anestrus, and there are many syndromes that could be due to nutrition, and this could be due to low condition at calving or to higher condition at calving. And when you look at the specific reasons for abortions and stillborns and dystochias and retained placentas, you know that basically all nutrients play a role. The protein balance, the energy density, and the energy that they get in. And you think about the macro minerals, think about the milk fever syndrome, because retained placentas and all this can be associated with hypocalcemia. And then you see this as part of the problem of a hypocalcemia problem. When we get to the field of trace minerals, there are many examples of trace mineral deficiencies which can also cause these syndromes. When we get to the syndrome of subestrus and anestrus, it's again a lot of nutritional problems, but mainly energy deficiency. So this is some key fertility parameters on that herd. So you can see that the fertility performance is poor. Days calving to first AI on average was 86. Your target that I work on is 65 to 75 days. That obviously depends on level of milk yield, because we know that there is an association between milk yield and commencement of estrus and estrus activity. Thinking again about the negative energy balance. The first AI conception rate was poor, 37%. The target is definitely around about 50, preferably 55%. Days calving to conception 134. Target is 85 to 110 days. Days in milk 187. Obviously that is due to late lactation. You've got relatively, when you look at the herd structure, there will be more cows in late lactation. Now, obviously, we know that days in milk is influenced by other factors as well. The calving pattern, for instance, can also. But at this stage, the herd used to be on seasonal calvings, but during that time, the farmer changed to all year-round calving. And then inseminations per conception. So there was a clear conception problem in this herd, which the private vet informed me about. Now, when you deal with fertility problems, we know that it can be a complex problem. The major factors are management policy of the farmer, and then the health condition and fertility of the cow, which I'm going to concentrate on. And we haven't got time to concentrate, but we know that these managemental issues with regard to the intensity and accuracy and of estrus observation is critical. With regard to fertility performance. And then if all the factors around the efficiency of AI management. Many farmers has got cover-up bulls, so obviously you must make sure that the bulls are fine. That's me with steerance, being on a herd visit. So what I want to emphasize here, we must be careful that we don't only deliver a technical service. You can teach anyone to do PDs and to check postpartum cows and so on, and the condition of the cows and so on. But you must use this opportunity, and this is what I learned over many years. I must admit, in my very young days, I also did what I used to call rectal tourism. That is just a technical service. This is opportunity. So if you think something is wrong with the condition, the anestrus, if you find the feces for the dung, I've diagnosed many cases of subacute rumen acidosis during my routine visits. Then you can go and investigate why. And I've also came across many of the issues that Kenneth Botha discussed yesterday. So make use of this opportunity and do it correctly. As I've said, anestrus was a problem on this herd. We know that it's critical. The timing, duration, and magnitude of the negative energy and interact to determine the extent to which a negative energy balance will alter the GnRH secretion to get that cascade going. So we want to minimize excessive body condition loss in early lactation. It starts with the calving, the condition of the cows at calving. So the body condition at breeding must be 2 to 2.5, preferably 2.5 when you breed, and with less than 10% cows in low condition. Because when you go to herds, and especially high producing herds, you will always get some cows which are very high producers and which will drop below 2 condition. But it's a low proportion, and that is what is important. So optimal nutrition in dairy cows is critical for fertility performance, to get a nice, good functional corpus luteum and nice follicles, fertile follicles to develop. So during my farm visit in 2001, I went out to the farm together with a nutritionist, together with the private vet, and this is what we found. It was, please note, it was August, and I'll come back to that just now. And there was very limited rye clover pastures, only 2 hours per day, due to the limited availability of those pastures. And there was ad-lib grass hay that was fed, and then the rest of the day they were on kikuyu forage, the right bottom picture. You know, in that time of the year, the kikuyu is still dormant, and you're still left with this standing hay from kikuyu that we call forage. And then they were on a post-parlor concentrate feeding, and this was a farmer's own mix, a recipe that he got somewhere, I don't know where. And then they also received free choice mineral licks. Now, when we look at pastures, pasture science is obviously one of the fields that you need when you're dealing with pasture-based science, with pasture-based farmers. You need to develop your skills with regard to pastures, because there's obviously, this is a whole study on its own. And we are not pasture scientists, but again, you need to know enough about pastures so that you are able to at least identify a problem when you see it and be able to evaluate it. So when you look at the growth curve, the red line of kikuyu, we know it's a subtropical grass, so most of your production is in summer months. In winter months, it's dormant. And then rye clover, which was perennial ryegrass, and clover, cool season grasses, so you get a little peak in autumn, and then it goes down, the production potential in cold winter months, and then it will start to rise in early spring. So by around about September, you will have your most thing. Now, you know that there's a lot of factors that affects this. And now I want you to please note that you've got a trough with regard to forages that is available from pastures. Now, in a moment, I'm going to say a few words about silage. And this is a critical thing that I mentioned earlier that I want to repeat, is that the farmers stopped producing silage, because silage, you can go to these modern pasture-based farmers in the country, and many of them will have silage as a supplementary forage to fill those gaps. So your supplementary roughages as well as your supplementary concentrates eventually is all important. With kikuyu forage, that's a close-by picture. We can start to ask questions about what is the actual dry matter intake from here? What is the quality of this? And this is where the nutritionist was very helpful. when he finally evaluated the ration and so on. When we look at the average composition of rye clover, we know it's variable. Here I've got the seasonal variation, but within seasons it can still be variable, even from day to day. And the nutrient limitations, I will just summarize now, but very quickly, the energy is low, the total crude protein as a crude index is high, and then because the RDP is 75 to 80% of the crude protein. Now this is very high, because we know that the crude protein in pastures is mostly non-protein nitrogens, and then soluble proteins, and that's why the RDP is so high. And we know that the balance between RDP and the rumen undegradable protein is critical for dairy production. The crude fiber seems to be okay, but I'll come back to that. It's not effective fiber. And then very important is that the main supply of energy is the non-fiber carbohydrates, which is the starch, and then the sugar, the water-soluble carbohydrates, and then also included in NFC, although it's a fiber, is pectin, and that is low, and that is the main reason why the energy density of 9.1 to 9.7 in pastures is low due to that limitation. The minerals is also calcium, phosphate, magnesium are all low, and then please note that potassium is high, especially when you're dealing with dry cows. We know that potassium is a strong cation, and it can predispose to milk fever. This standard table comes from standard textbooks, where you can see if you've got 2 hours grazing time, your ass-fed intake will be approximately 15 to 20, which will give you a 3 to 4 kilograms, or only 3 to 4 kilograms of dry matter. Now, there's obviously a lot of factors. The grazing time is just one, and it depends on the pasture availability, seasonal growth patterns, as I've already shown you, and then short-term variations. And it also depends on many other factors. As I've said, pasture science, you need to be friends with a pasture scientist and develop your skills in that as well. So in summary, pasture limitations: pasture often low in physical effective fiber, the PENDF, non-neutral detergent fiber. The high moisture will lead, because it's 80% moisture, so that will lead to high passage rate. It's got usually low butter fat, which wasn't the case in this herd, and the silage and the hay will add effective fiber. Energy, most limiting nutrient. As I've said, in your final ration, in your final diet, NFC needs to be at 35. Now, this is very low, so you need to supplement that with your concentrate. And that, as I've said, that has got long-term effects on all that. Maize silage. Richard gave you an excellent lecture yesterday on maize. And so I want to end. So the farmer, as I've said there in red, he stopped producing maize silage. And maize silage is a fantastic forage supplement for pasture-based farms, because good quality maize silage can be high in grain, which will give you a starch content of at least 40%. So that's why your energy will be about 10 megajoules metabolizable energy per kilogram. And so that is some of the parameters. Maize silage is obviously high in moisture. Your dry matter is about 35–40%, but you're going to feed that together with hay. So just keep that in mind, because this was one of the critical problems on this farm. And fortunately, the farmer in his action started to produce silage again after he realized what he did. The protein imbalances, the protein is high. One must remember that obviously that the final nutrient intake is dependent on the dry matter intake. So although the crude protein is high, it doesn't mean that the final nutrient intake on proteins will be sufficient. But there's an imbalance here. And as I've said, you know, it's high in RDP. And in the total ration, the RDP should only be 62 to 68%, and the rest should be bypass protein. Your balance with NFC is critical because you know that the energy, the starch, the sugar is critical to work away the ammonia, which is used by the rumen microbes to build the rumen microbial proteins, which is then later available to the animals. So there are a serious deficiency of rumen undegradable proteins and then specific amino acids. So no surprise when you, and you know this, that there was also symptoms of low milk protein and high milk urea nitrogen, and this is important indicators of nutritional protein energy balance, most probably due to high rumen RDP, and it can even be indicative of ketosis. The mineral imbalances, these are low, and including your trace minerals, salt, and these minerals should be added. Okay, there's a farmer's concentrate mix, which was not formulated by a nutritionist. So we, in a classroom situation, this makes for a beautiful discussion when we go through all these different components. But unfortunately, we haven't got the time to do that. But your maize is too low to compensate for the starch, which is low in this in the pastures to supplement that. You need to look at the protein sources there. The feed lime is too high, and then urea. Urea must be removed. Urea is 100% rumen degradable, as you know, and you've already got a problem with RDP. There are more problems, but as I've said, we can't discuss it in detail. And that nutrient composition, you see that the energy density is too low to compensate for the pastures. The RUP is too low to compensate for the low RUP in pastures. The crude fiber, obviously, in the ADF, NDF seems to be okay, but obviously there are other sources of that. Non-structural carbohydrates is low to compensate for the deficiency in pastures. And the urea, you don't want to see it there. Okay, I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. So the general comments on that pastures, that's what I've just said now. The NSC is too low. The energy density should be higher than 11. When you look at commercial formulated supplementary concentrates, it's usually formulated at a 12 to 14% crude protein. You must remove the urea, and the high source of RUP should be included, like roasted soya and brewer's grain and fish meal, and there was too much lime. So the nutritionist calculated specific examples of various models of various intakes. I want to emphasize that this is obviously debatable. This is just one example, and because there are many more, the concentrate allocation obviously differ for the different groups. So I've sort of taken just this example here, and so various intakes have been calculated. And then you will see that the dry matter intake of this total intake from the hay and the fogage and the rye clover and so on is only 2.7 to 3.3% of body weight. Now, you know that cows in milk should consume, initially after calving, they only consume about 2 to 5%, and then which you need to increase to 3.5% and even to 4% of body weight. It starts with dry matter intake because successful, and Kenneth also emphasized it yesterday. And on silage, it was also emphasized. What is a dry matter intake? This is a key factor for achieving required nutrient intake. Now, obviously, now we've got all these factors that influence dry matter intake on pastures, and some of them I've mentioned, but there are more. The common mistake is to overestimate dry matter intake on pastures. So if we finally, that was done by the pasture scientist, and you compare it, you will see that with the NRC, National Research Council's recommendations, You can see that the total diet is low in energy. It's high in crude protein. The 140, 190 for NRC is obviously depending on the stage of lactation and milk yield. The crude fiber seems to be okay, but you need to ask questions about the effect of fiber. The RUP is way too low, 29%. Your target is 35%, according to NRC. And look at the NSC, non-structural carbohydrates, severely deficient. The fat is also, as another source of energy, is also too low. So those things can get attention. And so with regard to the minerals, the outstanding thing here is a very high potassium that needs to get attention. And then with regard to all the minerals that he gave, the trace minerals was actually too high. So the nutritionist reformulate, and this is what he came up with, the supplementary concentrate. So you will see it's much higher in maize silage. He included maize fish meal. The limestone was cut down, the urea was removed. And then when you look at the analysis of that, it looks much better. So that will be in a better position to address a deficiency. So I want to emphasize that dry cow and peripartal management is critical for these things. And with regard to pastures and transition cow nutrition, we need to recognize these same pasture limitations and risks. The major risk is the same, basically, energy. Remember, the close-up cows, the transition cows need to get increased densities. So the way you supplement them is critical to address the limitations. One thing that that stands out is potassium, especially in Kikuyu, and I've seen many cases of high incidences of milk fever due to high Kikuyu in pastures, especially if it's been highly fertilized. And if you've used effluent, urine and manure and slurry and so on, which is very high in potassium, and then you actually aggravate the problem. I can clearly remember specific cases on that. So the actions that was taken was a smaller herd integrated with ecotourism. The herd is still going nowadays. It's brand name products, which the visitors can come and buy there. And then you need to routine seasonal. So as I've said, the farmers started to produce silage again. The supplementary concentrates was reformulated by the nutritionist. That's not the job of the veterinarian. And the partial TMR was mentioned as an option. And then obviously you need to go on with routine monitoring. And then the years afterwards, the feedback was positive on the performance of this herd. So, in conclusion, why is it necessary to develop competency in nutrition? Now, it's quite easy, and this is just a few ideas. You can further add to that. It's got a primary influence on growth, health, and milk production and fertility. The veterinarian can be confronted with many problems and syndromes due to nutrition. So you are, with your ideal scheduled visits, you're in an ideal position to monitor this and do problem solving together with a nutritionist as and when needed. So it's actually the essential part of the whole concept of herd health and production. What is necessary? You need to obviously have a good knowledge of the dairy industry, herd health and production, nutrition, TMR systems, pasture-based systems, pasture science, economics. You must have a very good understanding of economics. You're not an economist, but many of these things you need a good peripheral working knowledge. Think about housing systems. I mean, you are not responsible to develop, but we know the importance of cow comfort, cubicle comfort. We know about the importance of feed bunk management, feed bunking. Think about the milking parlor, which Dr. Petzer is going to talk about tomorrow, where the milking machine and all that all play a role. So you've got many other disciplines You need to have built up your experience with modern sophisticated data systems and reports. Kenneth also emphasized that yesterday. I like the slide where he mentioned data, 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 data. And I want to re-emphasize that. And then, this is very important, a good working relationship with nutritionists, pasture scientists, farmers, and other disciplines to the mutual benefit of all. It's teamwork. It's like a rugby team. I mean, each one has got its core thing to do, but then you also need to know a bit about the other things as well, and to be able to give a good service to the farmer. You need to have good life skills, and sorry for that. And you're going to have a nice talk on Friday with regard to life skills, and so eventually holistic approach. How can you develop your life skills? Obviously, when you qualify, you haven't got enough knowledge. You need to do a lot of extensive self-study. It took me years to develop my competency with regard to nutrition. I attended many courses, CE courses, conferences, congresses. I remember when I went, those days in the 1980s, when I went to a course at Sedara Agricultural College with regard to dairy farming and concentrating on nutrition. I went to a course on fodder flow planning, pasture management and fodder flow planning. And this way you can develop your knowledge and skills. And that is important. And we must remember that you need to, initially when you're young, you must visit a lot of farms. I went to the trouble through and visited many farms throughout South Africa, and you can learn a lot from farmers. When you're young and qualified, don't try to impress farmers with your scholarship. Listen to farmers, see what's going on, how they do it. And I also had the privilege to visit a lot of, on an international level, when I was in different countries and so on. So you need to develop a good working relationship with other disciplines in the farmer. I want to re-emphasize, you're not a nutritionist, we work together. I know Kenneth Botha very well. We've done a lot of things together over the years, and it worked fantastically. And in my very young days, there was a tendency for competition between veterinarians and nutritionists and so on, which is not necessary. So I want to emphasize that. And again, I want to emphasize data systems and reports. And I want to ask the very valid question, how many veterinarians evaluate herd reports prior or during herd visits? There's a massive amount of herd reports that is available that can help you to guide you through the performance of the dairy herds. So in final conclusion, emphasis must focus on the multifactorial nature of herd health, production and fertility performance, and the adoption of a holistic approach. Okay. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you well and good success with your career. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You're welcome to pose your questions. You've got one question here, Prof, and I'm going to read it for you. How often do farmers consult veterinarians about the nutrition of their herd? And should the vet give advice or rather refer them to a specialized nutritionist?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I mean, primarily veterinarians are not consulted by dairy farmers to come and solve a nutritional problem. And that brings me again to that team approach. And I was in a fortunate position to be in many situations where I worked together with a nutritionist. This other case scenario that I visited my farmer friend, the veterinarian during his routine visit identified the problem, and he immediately contacted the nutritionist and told him he thinks this is the case here, so please come, you need the specialized knowledge of a nutritionist to solve this problem, which is a whole case scenario on its own. Now we haven't got the time to do that. So yeah, you are not primarily a nutritionist, so I want to emphasize it. But to understand the principles of herd health, fertility performance, growth performance of heifers, and I've given a few examples, and many more, and the association of nutrition with health problems. Obviously, you need to know a lot about nutrition. And as I've said, that first step, problem identification, and with time your experience can grow, and you can do farm inspections, and then develop your skills, which is very, very helpful. But I want to emphasize, we are not nutritionists as veterinarians. We work together. And that applies to all other disciplines as well, the same principles. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, the person said thank you. Any other question? You can also use the raise your hand option and just unmute yourself if you want to ask the question yourself. Okay, Nico du Plessis, you can continue.
Goeiemôre, dokter van het.
Goed self?
Nee, ons help nie beklaar nie. Hoor ek het net gehoor, ons is op 'n TMR stelsel op die oomblik en ons is besig om oor te skuif wat ons graslande gaan plant, dat ons beeste bietjie uit die lande uit kan kry om hulle voete op te help. Hoe skakel ons dit nou oor met die gras en die TMR om daai dieet bietjie meer gebalanseerd te kry? Wat is punte waarna ons kan kyk om net daai prosedure in plek te kry?
Wow, yeah, okay, I'll answer it in English for the, all the other people.
Yeah, can we just repeat the question
a lot
in
of
English?
things now.
Okay, sorry. Let me convert that into English for you.
Yeah.
We are currently on a full TMR. We are in the process of planting grasslands to get our cows out on grass for the day, just to help with hoof problems and get them moving around a bit as well. What is key factors that we can look at into getting better balanced diet now, because we're going to have pastures, grazing, and a TMR running as well?
Okay, so I think with the case study that I used, I've hopefully I've indicated all the limitations of pastures, and we know that you need to, if you want to use a partial TMR, I personally like it because I think you've got much better control to supplement the deficiency of pastures. With regard to your pasture development, obviously there you need to consult with a pasture scientist to help you with the development, because obviously you need farm planning there, and to think about the soils, what type of soil you've got, what is the quality of your soils, the texture of the soil, the structure of the soil, and all those things, the physical development that is needed, which obviously all cost money when you want to plant it, soil preparation, and so we can go on. What pasture types will suit your environment? Because obviously you've got all these whole array of temperate grasses and temperate legumes. And then with regard to your subtropical grasses, the most common one is kikuyu, but there are others like star grass and smudge finger and so on. And then all your choices with regard to the legumes. And think about the choice of mixed pastures. You do that for specific reasons, because if you think about, I think the most common mixed pasture is rye grass with white clover or a red clover. Now, obviously, you know that there are various cultivars of clovers and cultivars of ryegrass as well. So obviously this is, and so I can continue. There are many factors that need to be considered. Think about the irrigation. Think about the fertilization, which is obviously very complex. Now, I wanted just to tell you about, and I hope you can see this, this is a book on pasture management that I was involved with other people. The Outeniqua Research Station, close to George, also had a look at this. Now, this is not a detailed book on pasture scientists. This is written for basically for managers, and I will say for veterinarians as well, and for farmers in general. And you can get this book. You can order it from Elian. And so many of these factors that I've just mentioned are briefly discussed in this manual. There's also the last chapter is on health issues with regard to pastures. I think you've heard about cucuyo poisoning, and think about bloat and photosensitivity and ergot poisoning and all these different things that come up, nitrate poisoning. So it's very complex. Think about the risk of internal parasites on pastures that need to give attention. So about all those things there are specific. So I will definitely refer you to a pasture scientist. So I've just mentioned briefly, and I hope that answers your question, Nico.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Where do you farm?
We're currently in Eikenhof, south of Johannesburg.
Yeah. Okay.
So I've spoken to a pasture scientist. We've already done all our ground samples and
okay. Soil analysis and so on is critical.
And all that stuff. I just wanted to find out a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, and obviously in a session like this, I can't give you the whole detailed answer. So,
yes. No, 100%.
But as I've said, consult the pasture scientist.
100%.
Thank you very much, and good success with your enterprise.
Thank you.